What makes a great game? Is it the story, the gameplay, the world and setting, characters and quests? I would say that a great game is ultimately defined by the sum of its parts. Furthermore, I personally care less about how the game did in every single aspect. Rather, I try to focus on what the game cared about being good at. For instance, one of my favorite games of all time is BioShock. The colors, horrific creatures that used to be citizens, the big daddies and the little sisters, BioShock's atmosphere and setting are unrivaled in video games. And that's what most judge BioShock on, because at the end of the day, BioShock was a game that was about its setting. It was the story of Rapture and its downfall, and it was ultimately a critique of the philosophy known as objectivism. That's what BioShock was about. Now, I could look at that game and say the RPG mechanics with the plasmids were weak, and could have used more development. They weren't bad, per se, but they certainly could have been better. But ultimately, despite this potential criticism, I'd still claim BioShock to be a great game. Why? Because the point of BioShock wasn't to be an RPG, BioShock was about the setting and atmosphere, and the RPG mechanics existed in the game to add depth and utility to the concept of plasmids, which ties in nicely with Rapture's story. You can acquire upgrades for both your plasmids and your firearms, as well as your melee, and more options become available to you as you progress through the game. The thing is, you don't have to. Sure, you use plasmids themselves in combat, but acquiring these upgrades in particular is generally pretty optional. It's not forced on you to engage with these systems, and frankly, there isn't much benefit to it. All of this is to say, a game having systems that are brain dead, underdeveloped, or just outright flawed parts of its structure is completely forgivable. The thing is, it's only forgivable provided the aforementioned systems aren't forced on you. As long as you don't have to interact with those systems, they generally aren't a big issue. However, if systems like that are a required part of the experience, well, that's a different story. Elden Ring is a game I love. I mean, I love everything FromSoft makes, but Elden Ring is undoubtedly one of their best. The combat is awesome, the character builds are probably the best in FromSoft history, the hidden story is fascinating, and the open world is fine. Very pretty, good location variety, unique artistic vision, a visual wonder to be sure, but there's a lot of absolutely fucking nothing here. A lot of this game is spent riding from one point of interest to the next through a big, massive, beautiful area that ultimately doesn't serve a purpose. And despite Elden Ring's obscene amount of quality content you'd think would make it the most replayable game in FromSoft's catalog, I find it to be the least. And I think that's mostly attributable to the open world. Because unlike BioShock's RPG mechanics, which weren't really necessary for you to finish the game, Elden Ring's world is necessary to get through the game. This is fine, and at least the first and second playthroughs, there's still so much intrigue from the player. The problem comes after the initial honeymoon phase of the game. Once you know what's out there, the world remains visually striking, but it becomes substantially less interesting. And as a result, it no longer feels like a part of your playthroughs, it feels like a hindrance. Something that stands between you and the part of the game that doesn't get old, which is the combat. As a result, I do knock Elden Ring for its world, even though I don't want to because I think it initially served the game so well. That being said, I don't take too much away from Elden Ring for this. My first two playthroughs of the game totaled 120 hours, and I consider that an impressive amount of time for the world to stay wondrous and interesting. Elden Ring shouldn't have worked that well, but despite the obstacle it becomes on later playthroughs, the world was remarkably well designed, well enough to be fun to traverse for two in-depth playthroughs for me. So just keep this in mind. Systems that aren't the core of the game being underwhelming is absolutely fine, as long as they aren't necessary. As long as they don't actually affect the core experience, or more pertinently, as long as the game doesn't make the player think it does. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a video game. It is a Rockstar game, and Rockstar is a game company I have mixed feelings about. On one hand, I appreciate that they consistently deliver high quality, ambitious games with lots of content. Their games have a pretty good sense of humor, large, well designed worlds, interesting characters, and halfway decent sandboxes. On the other hand, there are a lot of things in their games that annoy the shit out of me, mainly how obscenely linear they are. There is always an extremely specific way Rockstar wants you to go through their games and quests, and there's basically no room for deviation within them whatsoever. I have to preface this video by saying even though I could talk about my likes and dislikes for Rockstar games all day, when it comes to Red Dead Redemption games, the products as a whole are great. I'm going to say some negative things about everyone's favorite Yeehaw game, but that doesn't mean I don't like it. With that said, Red Dead Redemption 2. Let's discuss. Now, I'm not a huge stickler when it comes to graphics. I think that ultimately the gameplay is what matters. If the gameplay is good and the graphics are bad, I'm not gonna care. If the gameplay is good and the graphics are also good, that's great too. I think it goes without saying that Red Dead 2's graphics are some of the best in the industry. I'm also not big on cinematics, but I'd be doing a game a massive disservice not to call out how incredible they look. I'll be the first to say that looking artistically distinct is a lot more important than looking realistic, but that doesn't change how impressive the game is from a visual standpoint, especially when you consider the fact that the in-game graphics are just as good as the cutscenes. It's a good thing too, because the actual gameplay is pretty uninteresting. While it may be more fun for some than others, pressing left trigger then right trigger over and over for hours gets pretty boring for me. That being said, while the gameplay is bland, it's not really bad enough for me to say it detracts from the overall experience in any major way. Rockstar's gameplay has never been the true core of their games anyway, so then what is at the core of Red Dead 2? Well, personally, I'm in it for the story. I think the internet as a whole pretty much concluded that Red Dead 2's story was one of the best stories in gaming, and I'm inclined to agree. I even think, from a story perspective, it beats the first game. Now, remember what I said at the beginning about judging a game on what to focus on. If we judge Red Dead 2 on its story, as we very well should, the game is undeniably a masterpiece. However, remember what else I said. It's fine for the game to have subpar aspects of its design, so long as the player isn't subjected to those aspects. If the aspects are optional, avoidable, or even if they simply don't punish you for not engaging with them, those aspects can be overlooked in favor of the true focus of the game. This applies to a few different parts of Red Dead 2. For example, having to maintain your weapons is a huge pain in the ass. Having to eat is a huge pain in the ass. I really hate that development time for this game was spent on these parts of the game because these parts of the game do not help the rest of it. If you actually had to do this to be able to progress and enjoy the game, these mechanics would be a massive blemish on the overall experience, simply because they don't improve the overall experience. Luckily for the game, however, these mechanics are essentially optional. Not eating technically does affect your health regeneration, and not cleaning your weapons technically lowers their effectiveness, but both negatives are so small you really won't notice them when you're playing the game. So despite these sins, I'm not going to bash the game for these things because they don't directly negatively affect the gameplay experience, though I think they might make the game worse overall in the long run. No, the real, big, nasty, horrific sin of Red Dead 2 is the phenomenally beautiful open world. Look at that, the immense detail, the photorealism, the sheer size. Truly deplorable. Shame on you, Red Dead Redemption 2. I've heard tons of people say that Red Dead Redemption 2's open world is great, and while I don't necessarily think I'm the one who's right, I do think they're all wrong. I think a lot of people confuse beauty with quality. Red Dead Redemption 2's open world is, for the most part, completely empty. A lot of time in the game is spent riding your horse from one place to another. Now, this isn't a problem in and of itself, because that's kind of just how open world games are. However, most of the best open world games make up for this by filling the world with interesting side content, NPCs, quests, etc. And Red Dead has this, just to a lesser extent, and also in less interesting ways. You find an NPC who asks you to take them somewhere. You take them there. Done. You get randomly ambushed while on the path. You kill a few guys. Done. The open world does have things to do, they just aren't very interesting. The dialogue you can get is nice, at least I'll give it that.
Glad I ran into you. Huh. I raised that horse, you know. Raised it since it was just a foal.
Losing a horse is hard. Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, that horse did right by me. Better than my husband, truth be told. That fool. Always complaining. But does he do something about it? Man barely lifts his hand to wave the flies away. Aside from to lift a drink, of course. Marriage, for me, has been nothing but trouble. But Biscuit, he was a fine animal. Loyal, smart, brave. Didn't take no guff, not from no one.
But it isn't nearly enough to dispel the pure buffer that is the oversized world of this game. The open world exists solely as a mandatory buffer between the player and the actual point of the game, which is to say the story. Wait a minute, you say. At the beginning of the video, you said that you had issues like this with Elden Ring's open world, but you didn't knock the game too hard for it. Are you just a FromSoft fanboy? Well, completely manufactured straw man I'm using to help my video. Yes, but I also have a reason. Well, two reasons. One is simple. Elden Ring's world is artistically rich. The areas are extremely creative in their aesthetics and style. Not only are the color palettes and natural formations different, but the architecture differs from area to area as well. Elden Ring's enemy variety also plays into this, because different areas obviously have different enemies. Granted, Elden Ring is a fantasy game, so it has an edge in that area, but still. Number two is something I also mentioned at the start, but Elden Ring's world actually does play an important part of the game for the first couple of playthroughs. The world of Red Dead has only one role, looking pretty and slowing you down. Red Dead would simply be a shorter game if the world was sized down or was made to be optional one way or another, but Elden Ring straight up wouldn't work as a game without its massive open world. It also helps that there are tons of sites of grace scattered throughout the lands between that serve as fast travel points. Once you've explored an area of Elden Ring, you don't have to go through all of it again if you ever find a reason to go back there. On Red Dead, on the other hand, if you have to go back to an area you've been to already for whatever reason, which admittedly is rare, but it does happen, most of the time you just have to buckle up and ride. Now this is where Red Dead 2 is lucky because it looks so pretty, because if it did, the game would be an absolute torture to drudge through. See, you can get away with a lot by being pretty. That being said, it doesn't change the fact that Red Dead 2's open world is not a bonus, it's a hindrance. Granted, I think most open worlds in games suck, especially the ones made by fucking Ubisoft, but I think it's particularly relevant to Red Dead 2 because even without the open world problems, Assassin's Creed would still suck ass. Without the open world problems, Red Dead would be a masterpiece. It wouldn't be perfect, of course, but it would be damn close. The biggest issue with Red Dead Redemption 2 is how much the game is willing to waste your time. I think back to one of the early missions in the game where you go drinking with Lenny. You get drunk and have to walk around the saloon trying to find him. The mission's kind of funny at first, I guess, but it becomes annoying to deal with the wonky movement and slowed animations, especially on repeat playthroughs. So much of this story-driven game is designed to do nothing but waste your time. The reason I can't confidently call Red Dead 2 a masterpiece is because I feel like so much of the game isn't there to support the rest of it, it's there to separate it. It's there to separate it and to separate it from you. But why? This video is about Red Dead Redemption 2, right? Well, kinda. While this is a way to partially critique Red Dead 2, I think it helps to focus on the bigger issue. Why do video games waste your time? Because it isn't just Red Dead 2 that does this. Lots of games have mechanics that exist solely to waste your time. Diablo 4 has this. World of Warcraft has this. Games that aren't made by Blizzard also have this. Even games I absolutely love, like Nier Replicant, have this. So what's the point? Why intentionally waste your players' time? Well, you kind of have to take it on a case-by-case basis. Some games want to waste your time for monetary gain. If a game has microtransactions or other things of that nature, they want you playing their game as long as possible because it increases the chance you'll spend some extra money. And if a game gives you the option to buy your way through the content, the developer suddenly has a monetary reason to make the game painful to drudge through, as it will cause more players to spend money on the skip. It's the reason games like Final Fantasy XIV and World of Warcraft sell character skips, and it's no coincidence that both of those games have one hell of a level grind experience. But all of these games have profit-driven reasons to waste your time. Why would single-player experiences like Nier or, of course, Red Dead Redemption want to do this? Well, there are a couple of potential reasons, but the one that makes the most sense to me is simply game runtime. A lot of people who play video games are weird. And they also care about their dollar per hour of game time ratio. Maybe the developers want longer runtimes for their games to appeal to that group of people. I know older games like Nier Replicant would have tons of minute fetch quests littered throughout the levels to pad the runtime, and maybe Red Dead's open world is just another version of that. Or maybe Rockstar genuinely didn't intend to waste players' time, which, I'll be real, I find that kind of hard to believe. This section isn't me giving a unifying reason for these decisions because frankly, I'm not smart enough to figure that shit out. I just think it's an interesting design trend across many different kinds of games, and I think that is what keeps Red Dead Redemption 2 from reaching the greatest of heights. Don't get me wrong, the game is great, but I can't help but feel like it came so close to being a masterpiece. It might be a bit off base for a video about Red Dead Redemption 2 to not even touch on the story, but I feel like there's nothing I can say that hasn't already been said. Besides, the game is over 5 years old at the time of me making this video, and the internet already had its fun crying over Arthur Morgan. The point of this video isn't to reach a conclusion. I like thinking about why games are great, and I think it's equally important to discuss why games are bad. I think it's also valuable to make sure you criticize your favorite games, because no game is perfect. Every single game in my top 10 games of all time has plenty of problems, except for Sekiro. That doesn't mean to only focus on the negative, because that's how you ruin good things. I think Red Dead 2 is fantastic. I think it's easy on the eyes, I think it plays well enough, and I think it has the greatest video game protagonist ever written and one of the greatest gaming stories ever told. I don't intend to discredit that, because I do love the game. But me loving the game, if anything, makes me want to criticize it more, and I wish more people were open to that idea. This video kind of jumped around a lot, and I apologize if it was hard to follow. I have a mess of jumbled opinions about games like this, and I will subject this script to the full brunt of my insanity. What was the point? There really wasn't a point. Just thoughts on my favorite hobby, and some tough love for one of the greatest flawed games ever made.
The many miles we walk, the many things we learn, the building of a shrine.